Me tīmata tātou te. Meno kero tātou, kia ora tātou. Kaikai mai, e whakarongo mai ana, e mātakitaki mai ana, e taku rongo kōrero, tata ki te whitu rau. Ko rehita mai mō tēnei kaupapa nui. Tēnei mate nui, e pēhe nei, e a tātou tiwi Māori. Nei ra, tāmihi ki a koutou, ngā koutou e whakaaro kia haere tēnei kaupapa. Tekana kia haere tonu te kōrero mō tēnei tumo mō mate. Kia kaua e noho wahanui mō tēnei kaupapa. Nei, kia ora tātou, hina ko tāku nei mahi, he whakatuwhera, ngungu te mea tika, te whakawhetaki tō tātou nei, mati nui tarangi. Re e pā, tēnei mātou, hina tu kia koe, kia tau mai tō manaaki tankirongi a mātou, ku hō mai tō kaha, kia ki tau e mātou kia ara tika. E rungi tēnei kaupapa e pēhe nei a mātou te iru Māori. Re manaaki mai, awhi tia mai, e a mātou, o te rā mātou whanaunga, e noho mai rau, rungi tēnā marae, huri no i te motu. E pā tukatu tēnei ino ki a koe, rungi te whakaaro, he mea tīmata, he mea mahi, he mea whakoti roti a koe. Korore ki toi ngā, āmene.
Āmene. Tēnā tātou. Tēnā tātou, tēnā koutou, he mihi kauatu ki a koutou ngā maunga kōrero. Ngā awa tapu, ngā iwi kāranga maa o Aotearoa, kua huihui mai nei. I te rangi nei ki tēnei kauhau, kauhau kōrero ara ngā raupapa webinar mo tēnei kaupapa te mate o ka Mori. Ko Pānia Lee tōku ingoa, he uri tēnei no te maunga o Taranaki. I konei māua ko taku hoa ko Moira Clooney, tēnei. Ko Moira Clooney tēnei. Ko māua ngā kaiwaka haere. Welcome and thank you all for joining us today for the first of 3 webinars for 2003 on Māori suicide prevention, brought to you by the Mental Health Foundation in collaboration with the Office of the Pro Vice Chancellor Māori Victoria University of Wellington, and also with the support of the Ministry of Health. My name is Pānia Lee from SPIN's Mental Health Foundation, and I will be co-facilitating with Moira Clooney. And the purpose of the webinar series is to share Indigenous knowledge and perspectives of Māori suicide prevention. It is a topic of discussion many whānau, hapu, iwi practitioners and clinicians, among others, are in search of answers of, and hope to reduce the numbers of attempted suicides and completed suicides within our communities. Nō reira e te iwi nau mai haramai ki te whanganui ātara e kia nei te whariwānanga Wikipedia.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Before we move on to today's speaker, I just wanted to cover off some of the logistical points. Our webinar runs from 12:30 to 1:30 today. Our presenter will begin with a 20-minute presentation, and after that we'll take questions from the audience in the room today and our viewers around the country. There are around just over 700 of you from all around the Motu, from Taitokoro up north down to Invercargill in the south, from the Chatham Islands back to Auckland, and a few people from around the world. So it's exciting. So we will hope to answer all of your questions today, although with 700 of you we might not get to all of them. We'll be keeping to time, so if we don't get to answer your questions today, we will try to answer those by email. If you have a question, please send it through by email to moira@mentalhealth.org.nz, or just reply to the registration email that you were sent. Or you can put it through on Twitter. Just use our Twitter name, which is @suicidenz. Please do send us through questions. We're hoping with these sessions to generate discussion and share ideas, so we're really keen to continue the conversations after this webinar.
Nei rā te mei ki te kaihautu I wakatere tēnei kaupapa taumaha. Te mate waka momori kua pāngia e ngai Māori. He uri tēnei ngō Ngāti Kaununu ki te wairoa ngai tau tūhoi huki. It is with great pleasure to welcome Kiri Lawson-Te today to today's webinar. Kiri comes to us from Otago University, where she is a lecturer in public health and hauora Māori. Kiri holds 2 degrees in behavioural psychology and recently submitted her PhD thesis in the School of Psychology here at Victoria University, which was a testament of over 20 years of her dedication to this kaupapa. Her doctoral thesis examined the role of the hapu in suicide prevention and healing. Kiri also wrote the evidential review, the first and only Māori suicide prevention strategy, Kia piki te ora o te tai tamariki, which was replaced by the All Ages strategy in 2006, but has continued to influence the way forward for Māori suicide prevention nationally and globally.
Kiri is a vocal advocate for the validation of Māori knowledge and processes for Māori suicide prevention. She's lobbied for Māori community-based responses to suicide for more than 20 years and continues to support whānau bereaved by suicide. Kiri was a Fulbright Scholar in 1999 and held a research fellowship at East West Centre in Hawaii, working on suicide prevention in the South Pacific. Kiri is also a member of the International Task Force of Indigenous Psychologists.
Today, Kiri will discuss the topic of Māori suicide prevention. What do we do? That is, what is the evidence for Māori and Indigenous suicide prevention? What do we know for Māori suicide prevention now and in the future? So without further ado, I hand it over to you, e te whae no mai hara mai. No te wā. Kia ora.
Ko te mea tuatahi he mihi tautoko, he mihi aroha tēnei ki o koutou e whakarongo mai nei tēnei ahiahi, e titiro mai nei hoki. He mihi whoto tēnei ki a koe paora, ngā kaimahi o te whare wānanga o Wikitoria, tēnā rā koutou katoa, the Office of the Pro Vice Chancellor Māori, tēnā rā koutou. Kia koe, he te hoa, ngā kaimahi kei roto I te Mental Health Foundation, he mihi tautoko tēnei ki a koutou mō koutou mahi whakahirehira, mō koutou rangatiratanga, kei wainganui o tēnei kaupapa. Kia ora everybody, greetings to all 700 and something of you. It's an honour and a privilege and a pleasure to be here talking to you today about the practicalities of what we can do to prevent Māori suicide. Can they see this?
Yeah.
Okay. Kia ora.
So you just press that button for the next one.
This one.
Yeah.
Kia ora, I'm a bit technologically incompetent, but aroha mai, we get there in the end. The kōrero that I want to share with you today starts out with some words of wisdom and encouragement from some of our leaders working in their communities in the kaupapa of suicide prevention. And I pay homage to those people, those members of our whānau, the parents who have lost kids to suicide, my own whānau included in that, those of us who are working long and hard in our communities to try and do something about this take, this kaupapa that we're all invested in. So I'll share some words of encouragement and wisdom with you. Then I want to talk about my nephew specifically, TK, Te Kākahu Whero King Hazel, ended his life on the 10th of March 2012. I really believe that it's important that we heed the lessons from that experience as a whānau, because it teaches us some things about what we need to do. Then I want to share the evidence with you. This evidence comes from two places. It comes from experience of Indigenous practitioners, Indigenous whānau, kaumātua, healers, psychologists, people working in the mental health services, in the institutions in which we find ourselves trying to promote a specifically mātauranga Māori approach to suicide prevention. And indeed that is true of Indigenous people all over the world. We're looking for answers in our own cultural strengths, in our cultural practices and processes, against a backdrop, a long history of historical and intergenerational trauma. So I want to talk to you about what we do know, and then to join the dots, and then to talk about the so what question. What does it all mean for those of us working in our communities? This is something that Cathy Irwin said in she did a peer review of some work that I did for the Ministry of Health. It was a review of the literature and the evidence concerning Māori and Indigenous suicide prevention, and also considered what might be promising interventions for suicide prevention. She said that a paradigm shift is required to deal with the issue of Māori suicide. This is something that I wholeheartedly agree with. What's a paradigm shift? It means that we need to change the way we're looking at this subject. And that paradigm shift or change in the way we look at this subject has to be based on the privileging of our worldviews as Māori, of our knowledge as Māori, of our values and of our processes. And what that drives is a change in the way we design interventions, the change in the way we think about Māori suicide prevention, and a change in the way that our strategies are framed. A Māori-centred approach to Māori suicide prevention is critical. We've tried it the mainstream way. We've tried this all over the world in Indigenous suicide prevention, and it hasn't worked. So it's time to validate, to value, to whakamana our own knowledge and our own processes. This is common thinking in Indigenous scholarship and Indigenous interventions for Indigenous suicide prevention the world over. This is my daughter. Out of the mouth of babes comes wisdom. Young people need to be able to talk to adults sometimes, but often we can't. No disrespect, Mum, kia ora mō tēnā, but sometimes adults don't know how to listen. It's up to us to help each other, but sometimes we need help with that. After Dad died, the only people I could talk to were my friends. I can't imagine talking to a mental health expert or a counsellor. They don't know me, and it takes trust to open up. You know me. This is one of the parents from Aropu that Tariana Turia pulled together recently to work out what we were going to do for the prevention of Māori suicide. It's not an easy thing to teach. I trusted my mum and my dad and my aunties and uncles when I was young, but as you grow up it sort of leaves you bit by bit. Things happen that sometimes strip that trust away. How can we teach it and give it to our kids so it becomes their āhua and never let it be stripped away? Talking about trust. Professor Sir Mason Durie, I can put my money on whānau. To all people that work with families is to be able to help sort a problem. Go beyond that and help a whānau build capability, leadership. Unwittingly, we put the whānau into a passive, dependent position and overlook the potential they might have for strength and for leadership. There's one of our practitioners who's been working in the kaupapa of suicide prevention for quite a few years now. We admit that we are insular. We don't want people to know what's going on in our whānau. We don't want to know what's going on over the back fence, let alone in the hapu next door and the iwi and the waka. We have to, as Māori, rise above our own issues to communicate with each other about the mamae that we hold. How do we deal with that? We have ideas that we can share and implement and take practical steps. I'm here to listen to the kōrero. Pāhia Turia. No strategy should be dependent upon a government contract. Hear, hear. That provides a service to a community to fix up those problems that is affecting those communities. Once that contract is gone, if those communities are no better off, any more resilient or able to sustain those strategies or approaches or responses that have been injected into those communities are going to end up where they are. The greatest resource is whānau. if you can lift their sights, value them, give them dignity, watch them go, we need to take stock of ourselves. I've been in positions where I have to fix families. What a waste of time. At the end of the day, we are de-dignifying people, taking away their dignity and sense of their future and responsibility. Are we trying to assume responsibility for families, or are we getting there just to tell them how wonderful they are? Dei miri tangata whiwhirangi. I want to introduce you to my nephew TK. He was 20 when he hung himself at home. This is his story. TK came from a background of severe bullying, and we know from the evidence that bullying is implicated in suicide. It drives up suicide risk. His father took his own life when TK was 4 years of age, another risk factor that we know about. He comes from a close-knit family, whānau, a protective factor. This is one of the strengths that was present in his life. There was a history of abuse within the whānau on one side of his whakapapa. There were gang affiliations on his papa's side. He was diagnosed with depression, anorexia and bulimia at 17. He was a client and in and out of the mental health services. He was raised in the Christian church. His uncle is a pastor in Paraparaumu. He dreamed of being a fashion designer, but there was no chance to realise his dreams. And so he kind of went on a pathway of unemployment with frustrated dreams, and over time lost hope. He used alcohol quite heavily. He was self-harming, and all of these were cries for help. They were signs on the wall or writing on the wall that none of us in the whānau really saw or understood. Here he is again, a beautiful boy. So his strengths and the protective factors in his story, he came from a strong and loving whānau, and he was connected to his whānau. He had dreams and goals and visions, moimoia. He had hope that one day he'd be able to be a fashion designer. He had a close-knit network of friends from the Gothic gay community, and he had a close-knit group of peer support. He was raised in the Christian church, so he had a belief in God, and in some respects he had faith, and we know that faith is a resiliency factor for suicide prevention. Belief in te ao wairua is a resiliency factor for suicide prevention. He had access to cultural identity and values, and we know this from the advice that this is a resiliency factor for suicide prevention from the work of Professor Sir Mason Durie and Rangitehi Tahupārai, and a number of others. He had giftings on his life. He was highly intelligent, he was creative, caring, courageous. He wasn't afraid to be gay, to be who he was. He was loving and lovable. Here's another picture of him. So the risk factors in his story were his father's suicide, the history of violence and gang membership. His sexuality was invisible. He was gay, but none of us talked about it. He had low self-esteem, which was reflected in his bulimia and anorexia. He was subjected to a lot of bullying and physical threats to his safety. He had unfulfilled dreams, confusion about his cultural identity, and there were an accumulation of stresses in his life. So what did we do? We supported him into training as a fashion designer. His mother opened her home to his friends. Youth looked out for him. His mates supported him via Facebook. His church supported him and involved him. And we searched for help when it became apparent that he had an issue with self-harming. And after his suicide, what did we do? We took him on to his marae, Whakarongo-Tai and Waikanae. We had a tangi for him. His friends spoke at his service. They performed a haka for him. That was for his mother's benefit mainly, and also for the benefit of his mates, because they wanted to honour him in some way, they wanted to validate him in some way, they wanted to show everybody who was present in the church at his tangi that they loved him, and that was the reason that they did toia mai. It drew his friends together. I kept an open home, so I opened my door to his mates and provided a safety net for them, so they would turn up all hours of the day and night in a number of different states. Kia ora. We sought grief counselling for his mum, which was not easy to find. We talked about his suicide openly. His friends, they would turn up at my home haurangi or drunk, but they would start to talk and they would start to open up and start to express their grief. His mates used Facebook as a form of social support. I tried to rally the Kapiti community. I sent out an email to any and everyone who would listen. I called it a call to action for suicide prevention in the Kapiti community. The response that I got from some of the mental health professionals and practitioners was very interesting, all about my professionalism in maintaining an open home for these kids. I would rather that they were at my place and out on the street doing God knows what with God knows who, and at all kinds of risk for, they were safe at home. I could see them, and over time they started to talk. Information and training was needed. That became apparent. Network amongst suicide prevention networks. We identified at-risk youth in his networks and tried to organise services and support for them. And we sought understanding about what had happened and started telling his story. So we could have done a number of things differently, and I realised that I might be running out of time, Tanya.
No.
Am I okay? All right,
Yep.
well done.
We're here.
So what could we have done differently? Well, we could have supported who he was. We knew that the boy was gay. We could have been open in our acknowledgement of that, in our understanding of that, and our validation of that. There's an excellent group for young people who come out as gay. It's called Out of School. They do some excellent mahi. We didn't know about them at the time, but had we have been aware of what was available in our local community, we might have been able to provide him with more targeted support, with more appropriate support, for him to explore and discover more about his sexuality and his identity as a young gay Māori male. Counselling and support to deal with the loss of his papa to suicide. We could have addressed the bullying and provided protection and safety for him. Historical trauma within the whānau and the history of abuse within the whānau, and we know from research amongst our North American colleagues and counterparts, there's been a lot of work conducted on historical trauma, which is trauma through generations, that travels through generations and lives on in current generations. And that trauma is attributed to the process of colonisation and the enduring legacy that it has left behind. That our young people in this day and age are born into and become legacy bearers of. We needed to look at a long-term agenda. supported the whānau and mum to raise her kids as a widow in a more kind of pragmatic and hands-on way. We could have looked at things like behavioural activation as suicide prevention, behavioural activation as a treatment of choice. What does that mean? It means getting busy, getting active for our young people who might be suffering from mild to moderate depression. Behavioural activation is the treatment of choice because it doesn't involve psychotropic medication, but it involves supporting them to get busy, to get active in their lives. We could have attended to the wairua issues more closely. We could have looked at cultural development strategies with him, strategies for self-determination, which has been found to be considered to be instrumental for the prevention of Indigenous suicide in a number of global studies. Professor Sir Mason Durie talks about sustained activism. Some of the research of a couple of academics in Canada, they researched 149 tribal bands in Canada, and they found that where young people and where the tribe was actively involved in its own, plotting the course of its own development, and actively involved in activism for land claims and various other tribal rights, that there was a low to nil suicide rate in communities that had formerly had high suicide rates. So we need to learn from that. We could have worked with the whānau to strengthen the capability and capacity of the whānau to be able to respond to the issues that our nephew was facing. There are specific interventions, and Nicole Coop will be speaking in another webinar coming up, which these are all advertised on the Mental Health Foundation website. Nicole Coop's been running or director of Te Ira Tangata, which is a research program looking at cultural development interventions, problem solving and other strategies for our kids that turn up at the hospital with having made medically significant suicide attempts or been self-harming. We could have kept them in the community. At the end of the day, the clinician can close the clinic door, but it's the whānau who pick up the pieces. It's the community that pick up the pieces. And so I fully believe that we need to pitch our interventions and focus our interventions and work with whānau at the level of whānau. We could have gotten down off our professional high horses. And what I mean by that is that there's so much, show me the evidence that cultural interventions work. Show me the evidence that, prove to me that a return to mātauranga Māori works. Show me the evidence that kōrero, sitting down with our karaua, our kuia, works as suicide prevention. And of course we don't have any orthodox evidence. I conducted a literature review recently for the Ministry of Health. There's very little evidence. The research dollars have been going into largely mainstream research, except for the research program of Dr. Nicole Coop. And we're all excited about what her research is going to teach us and what it's going to yield and tell us about Māori suicide prevention. So, I just believe as a mental health professional that we as whānau need to overcome our fear that the answers are actually within ourselves, that we have the wisdom that we need, the skills that we need. We need to stand together for the prevention of suicide. We need to seek help when we need help, but at the end of the day, we are the ones who bury our kids. We are the ones who have to address this issue. Okay. looking at the big picture, Indigenous suicide prevention, what we know. This is a little picture that I put together to look at this issue of historical trauma. Historical trauma, if you imagine the life of a person as similar to an awa, it has a source, or a river, it has a source. That at the source of the awa is whakapapa. That is the core, the heartbeat of our identity as Māori. That's what makes us Māori, it's what makes us unique. In the awa there are blockages or rocks that impede or block the flow of the river. Some of these blockages stem from a thing called historical trauma. This is what happened way back when this land was colonised. It's happened to Indigenous populations all over the world, and if we think or we sincerely believe that what happened in 1769 or 1840 doesn't have relevance in 2013, then we are wrong. And the reason that we are wrong is because there is circumstances were established at the time of colonisation, the removal of land, the alienation of culture. There was such a process of rapid and profound change that still impacts on our current situation and positioning within the society in Aotearoa, but also globally for Indigenous peoples the world over. So we need to understand, how does this trauma transfer and translate through history? How does it transfer and translate through generations, and what does it mean for suicide risk, or for setting up the risk factors, the circumstances, the determinants of suicide in 2013 and beyond? Then further down the awa, you'll see a waka, and that waka depicts, or is meant to represent, whānau self-determination. A whānau have a number of options and a number of choices that they can make in terms of suicide risk within the whānau. They can choose to branch off and take the clinical pathway, and that may involve committing a young person into psychiatric care or seeking answers from clinical psychologists. Or they can take the community support route, which may be looking for local supports, as is the case in Kawerau with Michelle Elliott and the leadership that she's just picked up a leadership role in that community, having lost her son 2 years ago. She has stood up and taken action in context of that community. Or there are cultural options. So the whole, this metaphor is about the whānau being the vehicle, the main way, the main process by which we can start to affect change in the way that we respond to suicide. Okay, whānau offer the most untapped potential for Māori suicide prevention. This is what the Honourable Tariana Durie said in 2012. And I put my name alongside of hers because I've been saying it too, and a number of us have been saying it. What is historical trauma? Well, I think I've addressed that already. Historical trauma creates intergenerational unresolved grief. It created poverty through land alienation. It created cultural loss. And many of our whānau are still living with that and bearing the brunt of that. Common themes in Indigenous suicide prevention, this is from the literature, it requires a paradigm shift. Power within, not power without. What does that mean? It means that the power resides in our whānau, our hapu, our iwi, our communities, our culture. cultural development, and I want to talk a little bit about Te Pātaka Uara in a minute. Gaining consciousness of who we are and where we come from, and this is specifically whakapapa consciousness. Self-determination enables us to privilege our own responses. Mana motu hake and the exercise of rangatiratanga. Cultural continuity, we know from the research of Chandler and Lalonde in Canada, provides a hedge or a protection against suicide. Long-term healing is the way we need to look at this kaupapa, not short-term treatment. It's about more than the alleviation of symptoms. It is about deep, wairua healing. The Whanganui Kaumātua Rangitihi Tahu Pārai said, "Let us return to our origins. Since the time we as Māori were immersed in the knowledge streams of tauiwi, we have become like a branch grafted to a foreign tree, producing fruit of a different quality and somewhat unpalatable. It is time that we returned to the rootstock of our ancestors." The ancestral rootstock of which Rangitihi Tahu Pārai spoke involves a number of values, core Māori values, and these are integral to Te Pātaka Uara. Whānau are collective and concerted in their approach. Kotahitanga, it's time that we stood up and stood together, united in our determination to fight this thing, to deal with suicide, to address this kaupapa. Whānau upokai... Sorry, I can't read that. Aroha mai. I've left my glasses at home. Can you find that for me, Palms? Upo kaitanga, whānau are well connected to their home, land and people. Whanaungatanga, whānau live with reciprocal obligations to each other, consistent with being part of and affirming the values of the wider collective. Wairuatanga, whānau are experiencing the fulfilment of life. Wairuatanga connects all of the principles and is central to the interconnectedness of all of the principles of whānau ora. Manaakitanga, through the expressions of aroha, hospitality, generosity and mutual respect as whānau practice. And that was all I was trying to do after my nephew took his life, was to manaaki his friends, was to quite simply open my home to them without judgment, without expectation, without preaching at them, without anything, just awhi and manaaki, feeding them, giving them a place, a safe place to rest, to sleep if they needed it, to kōrero when they were ready. Kaitiakitanga, whānau are working in empowering and enabling ways that foster and encourage self-determination, and te reo is strong and vibrant in the everyday lives of whānau. This is the ancestral rootstock of which Rangitihi Tahu Pārai was talking about. This is its depiction. This came from the second hui of the people that the Honourable Tagiana Turia called together to address this issue of Māori suicide prevention. So the revolution begins at home. You know, so often we look outside of ourselves for the answers, and yet they're there staring us in the face, but we don't always have the confidence or the courage to see what is there in front of us. And so we look for wisdom, we look for answers where there aren't any. We surrender our kids into psychiatric care, we send them away, we look for answers where they may not be found. This is a model of hapu transformation that came out of my PhD research. The other word for historical trauma is soul wounding. And so I interviewed a whole lot of my whānau and hapu leadership and taiohi within my hapu about how they saw healing, how they saw their obligations as hapu, as whānau in that healing process. And the interesting thing about this model is that it's underpinned by our own tikanga, our own values, our own worldviews as Māori, and our own behavioural protocols and practices or kawa. This also came from an analysis of suicide prevention kaupapa with Indigenous communities the world over. Understanding our history and its outcomes today has to be part of a healing process. And this is something that came out of the work of Dr. Eduardo Duran, who's an American Indian clinical psychologist. And he marries traditional healing practices of his people, the Lakota, with his training, or the knowledge that he has in clinical as a trained clinical psychologist. And he says that the rongoa, or the medicine, is in the pain. So when we understand that pain, where it's come from, when we gain consciousness and understanding about those things, then that sets the platform or provides us with guidance, with a light by which we can look at interventions and healing practices. The late Professor Robert Tekotahi Mahuta said, in one sense, all we have to offer to future generations is the past, containing as it does the hopes, the spirit, the determination of the people, their constant example of both virtue and of error. But what a treasure chest that really is, that is brightness enough to light the way. Whakapapa consciousness is about understanding who we are, where we come from. So we have this group called the homies, or another word for them is te ahi kāroa. These are the people who stay at home year after year, some through generations, and they keep the home fires burning. They look after the home territory. They are the homies in every sense of the word. Then we have the lost generations. In a technical term, these are called the diaspora. The diaspora are the lost ones. They're the ones generations ago, our tūpuna, for example, in Ngāti Kuri and Kaikoura, had to flee the area for a number of reasons, but they never returned. And so the diaspora are the people who are scattered to the four winds. They never go home, they have no connection with home. And so a healing strategy has to involve repatriation, reconnection with our whakapapa. We also need to deal with this ngangara, this monster that has arisen amongst some of our people, called internalised oppression, where we take on the role of the coloniser. And it is really a very destructive, internally destructive process that we need to deal with as Māori and as Indigenous peoples. So healing, the purpose of healing really is to provide the pathway back to ourselves through whakapapa reconnection and healing, through kōrero. You know, how in traditional times did we deal with mamae? Did we deal with issues amongst our whānau? We can learn a lot from returning to those practices, analysing their current relevancy, maybe bringing them up to date and looking at how they might be applied in 2013. Manaakitanga. It's just a very basic whakaaro, a basic process of awhiing and caring for each other and taking the time to do that. Whakawātea is about spiritual healing. This came out of the advice from the late Miriama Kahu and Aroha Puaharama. They were my whānau, and they've since passed on, but they talk to me about the importance of whakawātea, or spiritual healing practices, grief rituals. They talked about having faith and confidence in our own traditions, our own cultural values and practices. Cultural development, we know from the work of Professor Sir Mason Durie and a number of others, other Indigenous scholars in North America and Canada and other parts of the world, that cultural values are foundational for the promotion of positive health for Indigenous peoples. And there's two of them there, two cultural values, whanaungatanga and manaakitanga, by way of example. Leadership, it's absolutely vital. So I want to end with some of the summary from the first hui with the Honourable Tariana Turia, which took place on the 16th of December 2012. This was the conclusion. Kaimahia whānau ora services need to facilitate whānau telling their own stories. It may be that the people best placed to support the transformation of whānau are already placed within the whānau or broader network of the whānau. It is important that whānau are able to identify the resources for support they have within themselves, their histories and their networks. The role of kōrero in suicide prevention, intervention and postvention is important. Trust is essential. Peer support groups as well as intergenerational support mechanisms have proven effective amongst hui participants. Rather than fixing whānau, support services must help to equip whānau with the tools to navigate their own wellness. Whakapapa is a tool which can be used in understanding social responsibilities for the purposes of suicide prevention, intervention and postvention. There is a wealth of untapped potential in our traditional knowledge bases, including lessons to be drawn from characters such as Hinenui Bepo, which needs to be drawn on in the approach to Māori suicide prevention. Authoritative research on traditional methods for dealing with mamai is called for, as is a more thorough understanding of the positive implications of political activism on an individual. Te taha wairua is a critical component which must be addressed in Māori suicide prevention strategies, i.e. karakia, the application of mātauranga Māori. Māori suicide prevention must not solely rely on an individual's ability to access or reconnect with their taha Māori. Whānau must be engaged at every level of prevention, intervention and postvention, from governance to delivery of care. Whanaungatanga is a tool which can be used to celebrate the positive and connect individuals with a wider fabric of people. Whānau ora will mean different things to different whānau. It's important that whānau have the mana to determine their own wellness. There is a distinction to be made between whānau a whakapapa and whānau a kaupapa. For whānau to be well in every sense and unbundling and accounting of the histories and trauma they have suffered across generations needs to occur. So what? So what? So what does it all mean? Well, I'm putting it back into your hands, into our hands, and saying that that is for you to determine. Every single person listening to this kōrero, our researchers up at Otago University, kia ora, our community health workers, our whānau, Emma, Kutia, Ma, Michael, Māpihi, Pāhia, all of you working community in this kaupapa, that is for you to determine. But it has to be based around the preservation of our whakapapa. We all have a role to play in whakapapa preservation and protection to ensuring the continuity of our people. Healing is our kaupapa. Those of us who can should impact and influence what we can, when we can, where we can. Many hands make light work. The revolution really does begin at home. Me ko tahitanga tātou. Nō reira he mihi anō tēnei ki a koutou, a ki a tātou katoa. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Kia ora whānau. We've got about 6 minutes for a couple of questions.
She's just pulling up her taro. Do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, we've had quite a few questions come through by email. So just putting a few of them together, I guess. You've talked a bit about the role of kōrero and storytelling within whānau is important. How do we talk about suicide and healing safely, particularly with young people within school communities, within whānau and hapu, and show kids that there is hope for living?
Yeah. There's, I would make a few responses to that. Firstly, we have to evaluate whether we are the right ones to be talking to our young people. And I go back to my daughter's kōrero, and she said that she may not necessarily be willing to talk to a counsellor, but she would be willing to talk to friends. So my advice would be to equip those networks, those support networks, friends, in a safe way, to train them, to teach them how to talk to young people who have something to say. Silencing the subject has not helped us, and there's a difference between whānau talking about suicide and the media, for example, reporting suicide and blowing it out of proportion. Those are different things. In the old days, and the karawa from Te Arawa, he makes himself available to kōrero or young people who want to approach him, go and talk to him, and he always makes himself available. So it is about making ourselves available. When I opened my home to my nephew's friends, I had no expectation that they would pour out their souls to me or, talk to me, but over time that's exactly what they started to do. So it is about providing a safe context for them to be able to kōrero and to open up.
Another question we have is, how do health professionals equip themselves to communicate with whānau affected by suicide when most kaimahi are not equipped to service the needs of whānau?
Yeah. That's absolutely right, and that is something that we really need to get. Sorted. That there is a need for training, there is a need for development, there is a need for information and for knowledge to flow out to our kaimahi who are working on the coal face or at the coal face or on the front line with our whānau. So I totally agree with you. I like to think that through this webinar series, this is the start of information to flow out to our communities. This has been raised as an issue in the hui that Tariana called. And there is definitely a need for more investment in training and the development of resources to build capability and capacity amongst our kaimahi and also in context of our whānau.
Another question from Like Minds in Masterton has asked, for non-Māori, how best can we support Māori around the issue of suicide?
Yeah, kia ora. Firstly, I acknowledge this question. as Māori, we don't have the monopoly on Māori suicide prevention. It takes many hands to, to work this kaupapa, to be effective in this kaupapa. What I would say is that you need to establish local level relationships to make your availability known, to know without being whakahihi or arrogant or rude about this, but to know when to draw back, to open your ears and listen to what the whānau might be advising you to do, but always be willing to support and assist, and even on occasions wait in the wings to be invited in or to be asked for your support and for your help. But this kaupapa is something that concerns all of us and should concern all of us in New Zealand. That it is what's happening to our young people, and in greater number to our young Māori people, that should be a concern for every single citizen of this nation.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
That's probably a good place to wrap up, actually. So thanks again for your time, attention and participation, all of you at home, and
Kia ora.
thank you to Kiru for your insight and your perspective. And thanks to my colleagues at Victoria University of Wellington and the Mental Health Foundation for putting this together. As I said, there's a few questions that came through by email that we weren't able to answer, so we'll try and get some replies to you over the next week or so. The video and slides from this session will be available online as well, so if you've registered, we'll send you a link for those. The next webinar in this series is on February the 19th. That's around involving whānau and community in responses to Māori suicide prevention, and that's with Di Grinnell from Whānau Ora at Te Puni Kokore, and with Michael Naira from the Kia Piki Te Ora National Collective. So you can register for that and read more information at our website, which is spins.org.nz, so spinz.org.nz. Nō reira, wrap it up there, and I'll hand it over to Witi Ashby to close.
Kia ora matua, hei whakakapi. Ngā mihi.
Ki te mihi atu nei ki ngā tini hoki i whakarongo nei ki UN e kōrero, ki te mihi atu nei ki a koe. Te mihi atu nei ki a koe me mo kōrero, te mō hoho, anō reira inua i tātai i tēnei. Anō reira, e pāma nā ki te koe mātau e kore piku nei mui a koe. I kaha koe te tuku mai, tō aroha, tō wairu, aru nei a mātou. Puta anō ki tēnei kaupapa i whārehi nei mui a mātou i tēnei wā. Ke pā ke kaha puta manaki, tiaki. Puta anō ki o a tātou nei kau mātou e kuia e noho awangwanga nei i roto a tātou nei whare. Puta anō me wene o mātou nei kau mātou i kuia i roto a tātou nei hohipere. Nō reira e pā na hoki te rangatira tanga me te kaha me te kurori ake tonu, ake. Amen.
Amen.